start now. So today we're going to be talking about the census and we're going to be talking about labour market and travel to work, which is their latest drop of data that they have published. So just as a reminder about what the census is, it happens every 10 years. It gives us a picture of all the people and households in England and Wales. It helps organisations such as ourselves make decisions on planning and funding public services in our area, and that can include things like transport, education, and healthcare. Hi Lucy, I'm just doing an introduction at the moment, just to let you know that I'm recording the session. I hope that's okay for you.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm a bit late.
That's okay, no worries. And the census gives us a population level understanding, and it also enables us to compare what's going on in Somerset with other places and the national average. What's really great about the census this year is that they've created a census map, which is an interactive map where you can kind of delve into the different areas, zoom in and out, and you can go into detail about where people are with particular characteristics. There's a link there. I introduced it in the last webinar. I'm aware not everyone here was in the last one, but I will be using it at some points today to show you some of the interesting findings that we're finding. There is a link there as well that you can go to after the session, so you can have a bit of an explore as well and see what's going on in the different areas of Somerset. So just a reminder that this is the second webinar of 4. So I did one on the 17th of November on population. This is around labour market and travel to work. In January, we're going to be looking at housing and education. And then in February, we're going to be looking at health, disability and unpaid care. And all of the sessions will be recorded and slides shared. So if you can't make any of the other ones but are interested, please just email me and let me know, and I can share the slides and the recordings with you afterwards. So just a quick overview of what we looked at last time. So I think it's important to put what I'm going to say today in context. So the population stats in Somerset, with a population of 570,000. It's quite evenly spread across Somerset, but around a third do live in South Somerset, so slightly more than in other areas. We've got quite a high population who is 65 plus, compared to 18.4% in England, and deprivation does vary across the county. Welcome, Jane, just to let you know that I'm recording. I just want to check that that's okay with you. Yeah, okay. So today we're going to be looking at the labour market and travel to work data. So what does that mean? So the labour market data, we're going to be looking at economic activity. So that includes information on whether people are economically active or not. So people who are employees, self-employed, unemployed, retired, or looking after family or at home. We're also going to be looking at industry and occupation. So industry is things like telecoms, construction. Occupation is more around the roles people have within industry. So for example, nursery and midwifery. We'll also be looking at socio-economic classification, which kind of pulls together different parts of labour market statistics to come up with a classification for socio-economic status. And so we'll look at high, medium and low, and then not employed and students. After that, we'll then be looking at travel to work. So this data is really interesting. It looks at the distance travel to work. It also includes a lot on people who work mainly from home because of the date on which this was undertaken, and the method of travel to workplace. So thinking about whether people travel via cars, public transport, active travel or other means. We're going to touch on some of the key findings from these now, but we'll also be talking through the census map, so you're able to explore it and what's of interest to you in your own time. I've tried to pull out the key highlights. There is a lot more data out there, so I'm really keen for people to go away and explore it in their own time in the census map. Come back to me if you have any thoughts. I just wanted to highlight a caution. So the census took place in 2021 in March, and it was during the COVID pandemic. there were various lockdowns, various kind of things going on, furlough. So a lot of that information may have affected people's responses to the questions around, particularly around the labour market and travel to work. So it's just important to highlight that here and to take care when thinking about using this data for planning and policy. The ONS does have a lot more detail on their cautions around the data. I think it's particularly around furlough and what people defined themselves as working or not working. So if you would like more information on that, then please do go to the ONS website and they can give you a bit more guidance on how to use some of the data, particularly around labour market travel to work. I just wanted to highlight that as a caution in advance of what I'm going to be talking about today. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is economic activity, industry and occupation. So economic activity is defined as people in employment or looking for work, or they've got a job but they're waiting to start that job. People are aged 16 and over are asked this question, and as I said, the data was taken in March 2021. So what we found in Somerset is around 60% of residents are economically active, which is very similar to the England average. There's variation across the county, and what we found is there are the lowest levels in rural Somerset West. And so what we can see, on the flip side is that economic inactivity is the opposite of economic activity. So around 40% of residents are economically inactive. So they're people who didn't have a job in that time and had not been looking for work either, or could not start work within, the next couple of weeks. I think what's important to highlight here is that economically inactive also includes retired people. Therefore, it's not always a bad thing in inverted commas. In this case, and in the case of Somerset, we have an ageing population, and therefore we would expect quite high levels of economic inactivity in some areas. So here you see highest levels of economic inactivity in Minehead Outer and Porlock, 55.5%. But that's not surprising for us because in our previous webinar, we saw that there's quite a high proportion of people who are age 65 plus and who are retired who live in that area. So it's not a surprise that economic inactivity is higher in that area than some other areas of Somerset. We're next going to look at industry. So industry is looking at the current industry or business that an organisation's main activity is. So it can be things like retail, construction, manufacturing. There are very detailed codes on the different types of industry. I think there's 100 different codes, but they can be put together into broad categories. And the broad industries that employ the largest numbers of people in England at the time of the census are these 5 categories. So wholesale and retail trade, human health and social work, construction, education and manufacturing. And what we found in Somerset is that that trend is very similar. So the top 5 in Somerset are also those 5 areas. I think what's important to highlight here, though, which is my yellow highlighter, is that some of our local authorities have kind of more of some industries than others. So Somerset West and Taunton, for example, there's a peak for human health and social work activities. And that's driven by high numbers of people working in residential care activities. It's not surprising given that my last slide, we've got a lot of economically inactive people in that area. And from, as I mentioned before, from the previous webinar, we know that almost 40% of people living in some areas in Somerset West and Taunton are 65 plus. So it's not surprising that we're seeing a bit more of a peak there for social work activities. In Sedgemoor, we're seeing a peak for construction. So thinking about why might that be? What is it around Sedgemoor that there's more likely to be more people working in that industry? Mendip, we're seeing a bit more of a peak in education. It might be worth thinking about why that might be. Is there a high proportion of schools? Are the schools larger and therefore more of the workforce are working there? And then in South Somerset, we see a peak for manufacturing, and that's being driven by manufacturing of other transport equipment. So again, it might be that there's a particularly large factory in South Somerset that might be driving that data. As I mentioned before, there's around 100 different industries defined by the ONS, and they go into quite granular detail. So if there are particular industries that people are interested in, I would suggest going onto the census maps and exploring that further. You can look at industry by quite granular details to different locations. The next thing around labour market is occupation. So the definition of occupation is the census asked people what their job titles were for their main job and the main activity of their employer. And together those two come, they pull together a classification of what occupation is. Normally the published data is broken down into over 100 minor groups, but you can combine them to quite high level occupational categories. And what we've found is that the top 3 occupations in Somerset are professional occupations, skilled trade, and managers, directors, and senior officials. We're seeing quite a lot of, not a lot of variation across local authorities. Those are the 3 main ones. The percentages are very similar. But there are some differences within local authorities. So an example here that I've got is skilled trades occupations for Somerset West and Taunton. So more people are in this occupation in the west of the local authority compared to those living closer to Taunton and Wellington. As you can see in the map, the darker blue shows that there's more people doing that role versus the lighter green around Taunton and Wellington, where fewer people are doing those occupations. We're going to move on to socioeconomic data now, and I'll quickly explain what that means. So the National Statistics Socioeconomic Classification, the NSSEC, indicates a person's socioeconomic position based on their occupation and other job characteristics. So it's based on their occupation, whether they're employed, self-employed, supervising other employees. Full-time students have got their own category, and those who are unemployed or long-term unemployed have got their own category, and they're number 8. So 1 to 2 is the higher managerial, administrative, and professional occupations, what some would define as higher socioeconomic group. 3 to 5 is more intermediate occupations, and 6 to 7 are routine and manual occupations. And so what we see here is across Somerset, there's quite an even split across those 3 main categories of socioeconomic status. It's around 1/3 for each one. And then the additional 10% of never worked or long-term unemployed and full-time students. There's slight variations across the different local authorities. So Somerset West and Taunton, Mendip have slightly higher socioeconomic groups of 34%. And on the flip side, have lower percentages of low socioeconomic groups of 25%. But in general, it's quite similar across the board. There's not too much variation. But if we delve a little bit deeper, what we find is that there are differences between rural and urban areas. So what I've plotted here are the top 5 middle super output areas with the highest proportion of people in the highest socioeconomic groups. That's 1 to 2. So that's the light blue bar here. So Wedmore and Mark, Taunton, Road, Wales, Woodlands. They all have 40% plus people in that higher socioeconomic group. And when we compare that to those with the lowest proportion of people in that group who have 20%, around 20% or less than 20% people living there in that group, those areas are all urban, so Chard, Taunton, 3 areas of Bridgewater. We're seeing a lot lower proportion of people with higher socioeconomic groups in those areas. So we're really seeing quite a stark difference between rural and urban, and this is just to show that there is quite a big difference between rural and urban, and it's not the case for every single rural area and every single urban area across Somerset, but it shows that the top 5 and the bottom 5 there is that difference, and rural and urban is a key factor in that. I think what's interesting to note here as well is that 3 areas of Bridgwater are coming up together in the bottom of the graph there. So it's interesting to think about what's going on in Bridgwater. So given that, I'm going to move over to the census map and just show you a bit of how you can explore what's going on, what might be going on in Bridgwater. So what we found in Bridgwater is that there's quite a high proportion of people in the lower socioeconomic groups, and we found that in Bridgwater North, Bridgwater Town, and Bridgwater South. So what we thought would be interesting is to look at, okay, what's going on in those areas. So what we found is there's quite a high proportion of people in those areas that are economically active. It's around 60%. But if we zoom in a bit more into Bridgwater, what you can see is that it varies quite a lot by local area. So we're seeing some areas that 80% plus people who are economically active, but some areas are quite low, so 36%, 40%, 50%. So it's a real spread of economically active. What we can also look at is industry. So we can have a quick look at industry and see what's going on here. As I mentioned before, there's quite a long list of different industries that you can pick, and it's quite detailed. But what we found was, when we were kind of delving a bit deeper, is that construction was quite high for Bridgwater. We also found that wholesale and retail trade was quite high, and also social work as well. So if we look here at social work, this is a relatively high proportion of people working in social work, residential care activities as well, which is very similar. So what we found is that, you know, construction, wholesale and retail trade, social work seem to be the top 3 areas for Bridgwater. You can also have a look at occupation, see what jobs people are doing. So managers, directors, and senior officials, professional occupations. There seems to be a relatively low percentage, but when we kind of go down to elementary occupations, we're seeing quite a high proportion of people that are working in elementary occupations. And also quite a high proportion of people in process plant and machine operatives. So again, that's kind of might be one of the things that is driving that lower socioeconomic status. I think it's also important to put the work data in context of the population of people that are living there. So if we go to age, there's a relatively high proportion of working age people, 16 to 64-year-olds. There's also quite a high proportion of areas that are deprived in 3 or more dimensions. So there are some areas of Bridgwater where we're seeing high levels of deprivation compared to some other areas of Somerset. So it's just interesting to put that data around socioeconomic status in context of the different areas of Bridgwater and what might be driving that. There's plenty more data that you can look at. So, for example, age, living arrangements, population density, sex. So I think it's just interesting to explore as why things might be happening in Bridgwater. So now I'm going to move on over to look at travel to work. So in the travel to work, there are 2 main things that we are looking at, and that's distance travel to work and the mode of transport of getting to work. So what we've found in Somerset is around 1/3 of people travel relatively short distances to work. So 35.4% travel short distance to work in England. So when we say short distances, we're saying less than 10 kilometres. It's very similar in Somerset, except in Mendip, which is slightly lower. It's less than 30% in Mendip. What we are finding is that some urban areas in Somerset, we're seeing quite a lot of travel that's less than 2 kilometres to work, so that's very short distance. So for example, here, Minehead town, almost 40% of people who travel to work in Minehead do so they are travelling less than 2 kilometres. So it's very short distance. It means that they're basically living and working within Minehead. As I mentioned before, the census was done in March 2021, which was kind of pandemic times and a lot of people working from home, and some still are. What we found though in Somerset is there was a lower proportion of working from home than nationally. Around a quarter of residents were working from home or mainly at or from home, which was lower than the national average of 31.2%. Thinking back to those industries and the occupations, it might be some of those things that are driving that. And it ranged from 22.9% to almost 30% in Mendip. So Mendip's more on that national level, and Sedgemoor is quite a lot lower. We found there was lower rates of working from home in urban areas. So if you look at this map here, Bridgewater, Taunton, Wellington, the kind of more urban areas, it's a lot lighter. So it's the lighter green, and that means that there's a lower proportion of people working from home there versus the more rural areas where you get into the blues and the dark blues where people are working from home. And that might have been access to work. It might have been type of role. And like as we said before, at Bridgewater, some of the roles that people were doing, for example, social care and construction, you can't work from home in those roles. So that might be some of the things that are driving why people are working from home. So travelling to work, what we're seeing here is that there's 26% of people who mainly work from home and 58% of people who are using a car or a van to get to work. So that's either they're driving the car or van or they're a passenger in the car or van. So we're seeing a huge reliance really on motor transport. So that means that 84% of Somerset residents are either working from home or they're using a car or a van to get to work, which is a very high percentage. We're seeing around 10% of residents getting to work on foot, so that could be walking or running. 2.5% of residents are cycling, and then we're seeing a very small proportion of residents using public transport, so only 1.3% use a bus and only 0.3% use a train to get to work. And then we're seeing around 1.7% using other means of getting to work. So that could be a taxi, a motorcycle, any other definition of how they're getting to work. So I think what's really important here to highlight is that 58% is quite high. And as we go on to this slide, I just want to highlight a bit more of what's going on there with the high proportion of residents driving to work. So the 54% here is residents who are driving. There's an additional 4% who are passengers. We're seeing a high of 57% in Sedgemoor of those driving. This is significantly higher than the national average in England, so 45.1% for England. It's important to note in England, though, we've got some very big cities who have got very good public transport. So, for example, London, Manchester, Birmingham, who will be driving down that figure. But on the flip side, we do have a lot of rural areas as well, where public transport isn't as great, and so we'll have similar percentages to us. But I think what's interesting here is that those driving to work, they tend to be quite concentrated around those major roads. So as you can see here, the dark blue is a higher proportion of people driving, and you can see that they're all kind of living around that M5 belt. We don't know where they're going, but maybe going up to Bristol, down to Bridgewater, Taunton. But you can see there's quite a clustering there around that kind of living around the M5 and driving to work. We also see a similar thing on the A303 down near Yeovil and Chard. We're seeing a bit more of a clustering as well around the A303. We're not seeing the same kind of clustering around, for example, Frome and Glastonbury and areas like that. There's no clustering around some of the main roads around there. It is mainly the M5 up here and the A303 down in Yeovil and Chard. We've got very, very low rates of people travelling to work by public transport. So only 0.3% of Somerset residents travel to work via train. I think what's interesting to note here is that we're not seeing any higher rates with those that have access to train stations. So, for example, people who live in Taunton or Yeovil or Frome or Castle Carey, we're not seeing a particularly higher percentage rate of people who live there that use those train stations for work. I think in some areas it goes up to about 0.5%, so it's really very, very slim. We're also seeing exceptionally low rates of travel by bus. I think it was only around 1.3%, and we're only seeing Watchet and Bridgewater of having relatively high rates of travelling by bus. And when I say relatively high, I mean relative to the rest of Somerset, not relative to the rest of England. And I think there's a couple of things driving this. We're a relatively rural county. Public transport isn't the best across Somerset. It can be difficult to get to places via bus and by train. I get to work by train, but have multiple issues all the time with it. And it's not, it's not the best connections. So that might be one of the reasons why people are not travelling to work by public transport. It would be interesting to see what's going on in Watchet and Bridgewater, to see if there's anything in particular that they're doing that means that they're getting slightly higher rates of people travelling by bus. Be interesting to explore that a bit more perhaps and see if there's anything we can learn from that and take to other areas of Somerset. Now for the really interesting stuff is travelling to work, the active travel. So in this data, what we mean by active travel is travelling on foot or travelling by cycling. So travelling on foot is more popular than cycling. About 10% of people travel by foot and 2.5% cycling. In some urban areas, we're getting up to 20% of residents getting to work on foot. So Yeovil, Taunton, Chard, we're seeing some really high percentages of people walking or running to work. We're not seeing as higher rates for cycling, so around 5 to 7% of those areas are cycling. Again, this difference between on foot and cycling we're seeing across England, and there's only pockets of places in England where we see something a bit different. So if you zoom out of the map, you see Oxford and Cambridge basically as really big cycling towns, which they're often quite famous for as well. So I think there's kind of, it's interesting to show that people are more likely to go on foot than they are to cycle, and there might be a number of reasons for that. So my next slide, I'm going to explore a bit more about distance to travel and then type of travel to kind of merge the two and see a bit more about what's going on there. So this slide, we're looking at the relationship between distance to travel to work and active travel. So here we're just looking at where travel to work is really short, so that's less than 2 kilometres. So the top 6 areas where a high proportion of people are travelling for less than 2 kilometres are on the graph. So as you can see, they're all urban areas. So this is where the highest proportion of people are travelling for less than 2 kilometres. Minehead, you're hitting almost 40% of people are travelling that shorter distance. And then what I'm comparing that to, so the lighter blue line is people who travel to work on foot or by bicycle. And that's everyone who's traveling on foot or by bicycle, not just those who are traveling less than 2 kilometres. So my first thing to show you here is that all of those percentages are lower than those who travel less than 2 kilometres. So that means everyone in Minehead who is cycling or walking to work, that proportion is still lower than those who are traveling less than 2 kilometres. So there's still people out there who travel less than 2 kilometres to work and are not walking or cycling. There might be good reasons for that, and for example, it might be you need to drive for a certain reason, or you're getting a bus, or you're getting a train. There are various different reasons why that might be, but I think what's interesting here is that we're not even hitting every single person who travels less than 2 kilometres. That 31% for Minehead, for bicycle or on foot is kind of everyone. So some of those people might be traveling further than 2 kilometers to get to work. So I think even for the shortest journeys, not everyone is doing active travel. It doesn't take into account the longer journeys that could be done by active travel. For example, those that are 2 to 5 kilometers or 5 to 10 kilometers. Some people might be happy to travel those distances, walking, running, cycling. I think what's interesting is that the gap is bigger for some areas than others. So Yeovil Town and Taunton, they're a lot smaller. And so active travel is probably a bit more on their radar. However, for Yeovil, Preston, Plugnet, it's 15% difference. So could there be an opportunity there? We know that a third of people living there are travelling less than 2 kilometres to work. How can we encourage them to travel more actively? But as I said, it's important to know that some people can't do active travel. So someone who's in the construction industry needs a van with all their tools, a midwife who needs to travel by car in case it's an emergency. So it's thinking about looking in those areas. What are the opportunities for those people who are living very close to work, talking to people living out there and understanding their barriers to active travel? Some of those barriers might be, there's not a lot we can do about them, but there might be some barriers out there that we can address and help solve. So here it's just to highlight where the differences are the greatest. So the travel who less than 2 kilometres versus those who travel on foot or by bike. As I said, Yeovil, Preston, Plunket is the highest. As you can see, they're all urban areas. So it's thinking about what can we do in those urban areas to encourage more active travel. And I think there are a number of things that could be going on that we could help support with that. I think what's really important to note here is that this is just around people who are traveling to work. So this doesn't cover children and young people who are traveling to school. So it's really about that travel to work commute rather than children and young people getting to school and around. So just wanted to highlight that to show the difference. So I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of slides about how this might relate to our work, and then I'll leave 5 minutes if anyone has any questions or thoughts that they wanted to ask me. So the census it only comes once every 10 years, and it's a great opportunity to help us understand the context that we're working in, and we can compare in activity levels, and it's important to think about how they are different by the different populations, what work they're doing, how they travel to work, their different population characteristics. All of this can help give us context to why people might be less active. It also can help us focus our efforts on particular places. So as I showed in the previous slide, we now know, the particular areas where a high proportion of people are traveling less than 2 kilometers. What can we do about that information? Is there something that we can do to focus on those areas more? I'm just going to quickly link then the census data to the active live survey. So some of the key findings we found from the active live survey was that Sedgemoor is the least active area. Over a third of adults across Somerset are in the lowest socioeconomic group, are inactive, and then 16 to 34-year-olds, the kind of young adults, are no longer the most active group. So previously, when we looked at the population data, what could that help tell us? So it can help us explore what might be driving the Sedgemoor least activity. Is it the older population, more isolated, more deprived? For the lower socioeconomic group, it can help us identify where they live, what's going on in those places that might make it more difficult to be active. And for the young adults, it can help us think about where they live, what levels of deprivation do they face. So this data can help us think about why are the residents in Sedgemoor more likely to drive to work? What's driving this? Is it occupation? Is it that access to the M5 that I showed you? Are those in the low socioeconomic group more likely to be long-term unemployed? If not, what do they do for work? How does that affect their ability to be active? Is it that they can't be active, like they can't do active travel because they need a van, for example, or they work particular shifts? And where do young people work? How do they get there? It's thinking about where can we fit in with this in terms of the labour market and active travel data. I'm quickly going to link this now to our Somerset move strategy. So hopefully you're all aware that we've got a strategy with 6 different pillars. I think one of the main pillars that this helps us explore more is the developing more active environments. So what does it mean for the strand of Somerset moves? You know, as I've mentioned, in some urban areas, over a third of people are travelling less than 2 kilometres. How can we encourage them to do active travel? But there's also additional 10% of residents across Somerset who are travelling 2 to 5 kilometres to work, and that could be an opportunity for active travel for them too. Cycling is less popular for short distances than being on foot, so what can we do to encourage cycling as well as walking? What is it that's stopping people from taking up cycling? And how can we use this data to help us identify areas to focus on? For example, those that are travelling shorter distances, is that an area that we want to focus on first because we know that they might be more likely to take up active travel than those travelling longer distances? What infrastructure might we need to develop more active environments? It just poses quite a lot of questions, this data, which hopefully will be useful for you all. And then finally, I just wanted to say that we've got 2 more webinars coming up, one on housing and education in January and one on health, disability and unpaid care in February. So if you are interested, please feel free to join those too. I'm going to finish sharing my slides now. And we've got about 5 minutes. If anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts on what I've presented today, then feel free to ask away.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Sorry if I missed it, but do you know what the national average for travelling by public transport is to work?
Oh, I don't know if I've got it actually, but I can
That's
find
fine.
it for you.
No, I'm sure I'll be able to find out.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that was really interesting. Thank you. Yeah. So is the interactive map available now?
Yeah, I will put it in the chat for you.
Thank you.
And so all of the data that I've showed you today, you can explore on that map.
Right. That's brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much.
That's all right. Sarah, I just had a look and I think it's around 6 to 8% of people in England that travel to work with public transport.
Thank you. That's a big difference, isn't it? That's huge.
Yeah, it is quite a big difference. And yeah, I think it is a lot of it's driven by that data around driving or being a passenger in a car or van. Yeah.
And less availability of public transport and buses, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. No, good. Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions on?
I suppose I just oh, do I need to put the camera on? I just wanted to say that it's interesting, the first time really that we've looked at those super output areas for looking at active travel, and I think about some of the comms that, you know, and the ways in which we might do some of our messaging in the future around that, around some of our campaigning, because given that we could be quite postcode specific around that. So I do think that that's it's real food for thought around that very granular data that we can get, and particularly layering that with occupations about what type of messaging would work best for people in those different roles. So yeah, I just really, you know, set off lots of sparks and lights about, you know, where we go. Thank you.
All right. It's got lots to think about. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I will share the recording with everyone and the slides as well. Please feel free to explore the census map, explore my slides, get back in touch with me if you've got any questions or any thoughts or anything. I'm more than happy to talk anything through with anyone. Happy to discuss, because I think it's quite interesting data, this one. So yeah, very happy to have further discussions if people would like them. But thank you for joining everyone, and hopefully see you soon.
Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Really